Your Excellencies, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, on behalf of the Lee Kuan Yew School of Public Policy at the National University of Singapore, it is my pleasure to welcome you to this afternoon's public lecture by the Honourable Kevin Rudd, Australia's Prime Minister from 2007 to 2010, and then 2013, and also the Foreign Minister from 2010 to 2012. My name is Kong Yun Fong, and I'm the Lee Ka-shing Professor of Political Science in the school, offering courses on American foreign policy, international relations of the Asia-Pacific. We are living in interesting times. The global order, often seen as the US-led rules-based international order, is under stress. The Trump administration's America's first agenda is seen by many as upending the very economic rules championed historically by the United States. As a result, recent tariffs imposed by the administration on China, the European Union, Canada, and Mexico, a global trade war looms. Australia is interestingly exempted, I think. On the security front, China has risen to a point where it has the resources to question and to challenge US predominance in the Asia or Indo-Pacific, pick whichever one you like. Political scientists call this power transition politics. And many of us in Southeast Asia have been feeling the tug and pull of the two great powers for some time now. To be sure, there's a bright spot or two. Just 2 weeks ago, President Donald Trump and Kim Jong-un descended on Singapore to take the first baby steps toward the denuclearization of the Korean Peninsula. The Economist magazine declared that Kim Jong won, that he got the equality of treatment he wanted so dearly from a sitting American president, and that Trump lost because nothing concrete came out of the meeting. But I think for some of us, on balance, it was probably better to have the meeting than not, and time will tell if it was a success for both parties and for the world. So what's the future of the global order? I can think of no better thinker, statesman, to help us grapple with this issue than Mr. Rudd. As Prime Minister, he led Australia's response during the global financial crisis, and he also helped found the G20. In 2015, he led a review of the UN system as chair of the Independent Commission on Multilateralism. He's also the Asia Society's Policy Institute's inaugural president, as well as having held distinguished fellowships from many of the world's most illustrious research and academic institutions, from Harvard's Kennedy School of Government to London's Chatham House to the Center for Strategic and International Studies in Washington, D.C. Mr. Rudd, as many of you know, is also deeply engaged with Asia and Asian institutions. He serves on the International Advisory Board of the Schwarzman Scholars Program at Tsinghua University, and he's honorary professor at Peking University. And last but not least, he's a superb Mandarin speaker. If you haven't seen his Chinese New Year greetings to his friends in flawless Mandarin, ushering in the Year of the Dog, I recommend it highly. It is a smashing hit, and you can see it on YouTube. Mr. Rudd has agreed to speak to us for about half an hour, and we'll have another half an hour or so for Q&A. Allow me now then to invite Mr. Kevin Rudd to share with us his reflections on U.S.-China relations, North Korea, and the future of the global order.
Good afternoon. Thank you for that very warm welcome, Professor. And it's good to see so many friends and colleagues from the Academy and from Singapore, who I've got to know over so many years. I'd like to particularly honour and acknowledge Professor Wang Gungwu, who was a distinguished professor at the Australian National University when I was a slightly irritating, snotty-nosed undergraduate there many, many years ago. Wang Gungwu was an enormous contributor to the development of sinology at our principal university, focusing on Asia, and your scholarship generally, Gungwu, is of true world standards. So it's good to see you here today, my friend. It's good to be back in Singapore. I've been here so many times over the years, it's kind of a bit of a second home, and as is the Lee Kuan Yew School itself. And the work that you do here is an important contribution to public policy, and of course to the study of Asia, and of course to the study of international relations. 3 days ago, the Chinese Communist Party concluded its Central Work Conference on Foreign Affairs, the second since Xi Jinping became General Secretary of the party and Chairman of the Central Military Commission back in October of 2012. The last one of these conferences was held in November of 2014. These conferences are not everyday affairs in the party's deliberations on the great questions of China's unfolding global engagement. These conferences are major authoritative gatherings of the entire leadership designed to synthesize China's official analysis of international trends and assess how China should anticipate and respond to them in the prosecution of its own national interests. This conference, like the last one, was presided over by Xi Jinping himself. It was attended by all 7 members of the Standing Committee of the Politburo, as well as ex officio member Wang Qishan, the Vice President, together with all other 18 members of the regular Politburo, in addition to everybody who is anybody in the entire Chinese foreign, security, military, economic, trade, finance, cyber and intelligence community, as well as the central think tank community as well. It's a meeting that's meant to be noticed by the entire Chinese international policy establishment, because if there is to be any new directive concerning China's place in the world, it's likely to be found somewhere in Xi Jinping's 3,000-character report to this conference. Of course, the entire deliberations of the conference are not made public. 3.5 years ago, only a selected part of it was broadcast and reported in the central media. The same this time as well. And unlike in Washington, the Chinese system does not leak every 12 hours, so we have to guess. There is, therefore, an often hazardous exercise in reading the tea leaves, in interpreting what it all means, discerning what is new, discerning what is newish, and what is not new at all. Nonetheless, what we can discern from this conference that might illuminate the subject I've been asked to address here this evening in Singapore on U.S.-China relations, North Korea, and the future of the global order is, I think, important. The truth is, a foreign policy work conference of the party centre has a much broader focus than the subject of my lecture this evening, because it deals in grand, historical, ideological and political themes, outlining the overall thrust of the country's future role in the world. But because these conferences are major events in the foreign policy life of the country, and they involve the entire leadership, and because it only happened a few days ago and without prior notice, with your indulgence, I thought it was better to spend some time this evening working through the contents of this particular conference. It sets the overall framework for any discussion of detailed policy, including on U.S.-China relations, including on the Koreas, including, of course, on the DPRK and its nuclear program. Of course, I'm happy to pursue any detailed questions on those subjects in the discussion that will follow. So what is new in this conference that's just been held? How does the 2018 Work Conference on Foreign Policy in Beijing compare with the last one, which was held in 2014? And what does all that mean? The 2014 Central Policy Work Conference on Foreign Policy represented, in my argument, the formal, official funeral of Deng Xiaoping's international policy dictum of the previous 30 years, of hide your strength, bide your time, never take the lead. 韬光养晦 绝不当头. It also heralded the beginning of a new period of confident, independent, international policy activism by Beijing. In part, this change reflected Xi Jinping's greater centralization of political power within the Chinese system. In part, it reflected the Chinese system's deep conclusion that American global power was in relative decline, and the United States would not confront China militarily if China sought to expand its regional military presence. In part, it also reflected a Chinese institutional conclusion that China had finally become an indispensable global economic power to most countries in the world, therefore enabling China to begin to project its economic influence bilaterally, regionally, and also multilaterally. It was also an expression of Xi Jinping's personal leadership temperament, which is impatient with the incremental bureaucratism endemic to the Chinese system, and with which the international community had become relaxed, comfortable, and thoroughly accustomed. For those who follow these events closely and have written on the importance of this significant departure from China's traditional strategic framework, dating from the 2014 conference, a number of developments since then have been illustrative of this overall change in the style and the content and the direction of China's international policy approach. China worked overtime in 2014-16, for example, to expand its military position in the South China Sea with a rapid program of island reclamation. China took the idea of the New Silk Road and turned it into a multi-trillion-dollar trade, investment, infrastructure, and wider geopolitical and geoeconomic initiative, engaging 68 different countries across much of Eurasia, Africa, and beyond. China in this period signed up most of the developed world in the first large-scale non-Bretton Woods multilateral development bank, called the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, the AIIB, capitalised it and launched it, so that it now has a balance sheet already approaching the size of the ADB. China has also become, for the first time, a multilateral diplomatic activist, launching diplomatic initiatives of its own, beyond its own immediate sphere of strategic interest here in the East Asian hemisphere, as well as actively participating in other initiatives such as the JCPOA on Iran, rather than declining to reach beyond its own narrowly defined core national interests, as we've often seen in the past. China has now developed naval bases in Sri Lanka, Pakistan, and now Djibouti, the latter with some 5,000 troops from the PLA stationed there, as well as participating in naval exercises with the Russians in the Sea of Japan, the Mediterranean, and even the Baltic. And now, in the most recent National People's Congress in March of this year, we have the decision to establish China's first ever International Development Agency to manage China's burgeoning aid programs across the developing world. Of course, these leave to one side the activities of Chinese state financial institutions, other Chinese SOEs, as well as Chinese mixed investment funds operating on every continent and now in every region of the world. It would be wrong analytically to say that all these suddenly began after the 2014 Central Foreign Policy Work Conference. Some began in the 2 years before then, after Xi first became General Secretary in late 2012, and some have their antecedents in the late Hu Jintao period as well. But my point here is that they all either began, were intensified, or else were formally publicly legitimised by the conclusions of the last work conference. People often respond to my speeches that way. I would prefer more fanfares if that's possible. In short, the system was given the mandate to contest, assert, and where possible to lead in the various councils of the world. And this was new, radically different from the past. Furthermore, anyone who continues to entertain the fanciful idea, which I still see sometimes in Western commentary, that these changes are not the product of a well-considered Chinese grand strategy, in my judgment, is simply choosing to ignore the clear evidence of clearly defined policy purpose systematically at work in the field. Our Chinese friends, in my experience, think things through carefully. They observe carefully, not just what is happening in the headlines, which is the permanent obsession of the Western political establishment, but what is happening in what Xi Jinping would describe as the underlying historical trends in international relations. And then, after a period of detailed internal reflection, consideration, and where necessary, consensus building within the system, a new direction is set. That's the Chinese way of doing things. We've seen it in so many branches of policy. That indeed is what these foreign policy central work conferences are about. They sum up where the system has got to in its analysis, and then what the system intends to do about it. It's part of the rolling system of policy analysis, implementation, and review that characterises the entire Chinese public policy system, both foreign and domestic. It is both one of the great strengths of the Chinese system, but also one of its great weaknesses, if the conclusions reached prove to be analytically flawed or unsustainable in practice. It takes a lot to turn the Chinese ship of state around once the course has been set from the top. So what changes with the 2018 Foreign Policy Work Conference? Is it more of the same, or simply an intensification of the trajectory? or a change in content and tone? The answer is all of the above, a blend of continuity and change. Let me run through 5 areas. The first, a new role for the party and ideology in foreign policy. The press reporting of the conference asserts the absolute centrality of the party to the country's foreign policy mission. This, of course, is not entirely new, but the emphasis on the role of the party is much stronger than before. In the recent past, the country's international policy establishment, like its econocrats, have seen themselves and have been seen by the Chinese political establishment as a technocratic elite. That is now changing in foreign policy as much as it has already changed in economic policy. This is part of a broader trend in Xi Jinping's China, whose focus is to rehabilitate the party from moral death from corruption on the one hand, and practical death from policy irrelevance on the other. Xi has been concerned that the party had become marginal to the country's major policy debates, given the technocratic complexity to most of the country's contemporary challenges. That is why, for example, we now see a revitalization of theory over practice, a reassertion of the power of the major institutions of the party over the major institutions of the state, and once again, a reassertion of political ideology over mere technocratic policy. Xi Jinping does not intend presiding over the party's death by 1,000 cuts, as it contends with a range of unfolding political forces unleashed by a combination of the market economy, social liberalisation and foreign influence. No, Xi Jinping intends for the party to defy the trend line of Western history, to see off Fukuyama's end of history and the inevitable triumph of Western liberal democratic capitalism, in order to preserve, in Xi Jinping's mind, a Leninist state for the long term as the most effective means of ensuring that China prevails in its domestic and economic and international challenges. That is why there is lengthy treatment in this conference on, to use the language of the Xinhua report, and I quote it, upholding the authority of the CPC Central Committee as the overarching principle and strengthening the centralised unified leadership of the party on external work, unquote. In case you missed the emphasis, Xi Jinping also states in the same report, diplomacy represents the will of the state and diplomatic power must stay with the CPC Central Committee, while external work is a systematic project, unquote. Xi also calls for, and I quote him again, implementing reform of the institutions and mechanisms concerning foreign affairs under the decision of the Central Party leadership and enhancing party building in institutions abroad so as to form a management mechanism catering to the requirements of the new era. The conference emphasised that China's diplomacy would now be, quote, a diplomacy of socialism with Chinese characteristics, unquote, and as such would take Xi Jinping thought from the domestic to the foreign policy domain. In the past, this language of socialism with Chinese characteristics applied to the overall Chinese ideological system, usually interpreted as China's own form of state capitalism. But now it's being applied to diplomacy, and it infers, I believe, something else. It seems to mean conforming diplomacy within a wider ideological worldview, which lies beyond the simple policy pragmatism we have seen for decades guiding most elements of Chinese foreign policy and the prosecution of China's national interests. There now seems to be a new national and/or global vision that sits above the simple maximisation of national interests. This seems more than the routine incantations of the China Dream, 中国梦, or the party's centenary objectives for 2021 and the national centenary mission for 2049, with which we have become familiar since Xi Jinping came to power. At this stage, this new overarching ideological mission may be inchoate, but the fact that it is as yet not fully formed does not mean that it does not exist. Lest there be any doubt on this count, the ranking foreign policy technocrat attending the work conference, former Foreign Minister and State Councillor Yang Jiechi, and now Director of the Foreign Policy Office of the Party Central Committee, refers explicitly to the ideological significance of the conference that's just been held. It's worth quoting Yang Jiechi's remarks at the conference at some length. He states that the most important outcome of this conference is, and I quote him, it established the guiding position of Xi Jinping thought on diplomacy. Xi Jinping thought on diplomacy is an important part of Xi Jinping thought on socialism with Chinese characteristics for a new era. It is a major theoretical achievement in the thoughts on state governance in the area of diplomacy by the CPC Central Committee, with Comrade Xi Jinping at the core, and a fundamental guideline for China's external work in the new era. We should now integrate our thoughts and actions into General Secretary Xi Jinping's important address and Xi Jinping thought on diplomacy and make new advances in China's external work. Now, to an international foreign policy audience, all this may sound just a little too arcane. That's because in the internal ideological deliberations of a one-party state, it is arcane. But we would be blind not to see that there is something new at play here. It is unclear whether this means Chinese foreign policy is likely to become more Marxist in its conceptualization or even in its execution, or whether it's likely to become more nationalist, whether it will seek to become more actively promoting of the Chinese development model of authoritarian capitalism as a model for the world in competition with the liberal democratic capitalism of the West, or whether it is a much more unformed worldview which will ultimately take shape around Xi Jinping's as yet deliberately vague concept of a global community of common destiny, which is now the subject of intense work within China's think tank community and with the international academic community, or whether it is something more mechanistic than that altogether, involving a desire simply to fire up China's current diplomatic establishment into a more invigorated, imaginative, creative, even forceful effort to shape the future global rules-based order more in China's image, rather than China being the permanent price taker for rules already determined elsewhere by others, particularly where elements of the existing order are seen to represent a continuing and unwelcome challenge to the legitimacy of China's domestic political order, for example in areas such as the rule of law, human rights and democracy. A second change in this Worth Conference, what I describe as a new ideological confidence that history now favours China. It is Xi's deeply Marxist dialectical materialist view of history based on permanently evolving contradictions between what dialecticians call thesis, antithesis and synthesis that you see evidenced also in this conference. In Xi Jinping's view, this dialectical materialist view of history gives rise to defined laws of historical development that are both prescriptive and predictive. Now, this may sound like old-fashioned Marxism. That's because it is. The intellectual software of generations of Chinese leaders has been shaped by this conceptual framework for interpreting and responding to what they define as objective reality. And Xi Jinping belongs to that tradition. Remember, he has already convened special study sessions at the Politburo on understanding both dialectical and historical materialism in the past. According to the conference report, quote, Xi Jinping suggested to not only observe the current international situation, but also review the past, summarise historical laws, and look towards the future to better understand the trend of history. Furthermore, according to the same report in Xinhua, to obtain, quote, an accurate understanding of the overall situation, Xi Jinping underlined not only the observation of detailed phenomena, but also a deep appreciation of the essence of the overall situation in order not to get lost in complexity and the changing international situation. Xi Jinping concludes on this count stating that throughout human history, the development of the world has always been the result of contradictions, intertwining and interreacting with each other. Once again, all this will seem more than a little arcane, but in the ideological dialect of the Chinese Communist Party, it seems to mean several things. First, that there is nothing random about what is unfolding in the world today. Second, these reflect certain immutable laws of political and economic development. Third, the business of Chinese foreign policy is to use this dialectical prism to understand precisely what is happening in the world today, why it is happening and what to do about it. And fourth, applying these disciplines to the current period, it means that the global order is at a turning point with the relative decline of the US and the West, and with this coinciding with the fortuitous national and international circumstances currently enabling China's rise. To use Xi Jinping's own language, he says, "This has been the best period of development since modern times, while the world is undergoing the most profound and unprecedented changes in a century." Adding that, and I quote him, "These two aspects are intertwined and interact with each other. That is, the relative changes and tipping point in the global order and China's rise." Xi Jinping refers to the current period as a period of unprecedented strategic opportunity for China and the current mission of the party. Although this of itself is not a new term, Xi Jinping says the party's mission is to extend the life of this period. And to do this, he calls for the party to engage in-depth analysis of the law, quote unquote, of how the international situation changes as the world comes into this transitional period, as well as developing an accurate grasp of the basic characteristics of the external environment China is facing at this historical juncture in order to better plan and facilitate the country's work on foreign affairs, unquote. In other words, removed from all the dialect, what is being said here is that in the view of the leadership, China now has the wind at its back. Of course, there are formidable obstacles ahead, but a dialectical analysis of history causes China's leadership to conclude that the forces of reaction facing the US and the West are much greater and more difficult and problematic than those facing China. Just as the contradictions operating domestically within the US and within the West, particularly in their political systems, are greater as well, which in turn renders China's overall domestic and international circumstances much better by comparison in the emerging contest between the two. All of which, again in this particular view, pushes towards a new historical synthesis which is more in China's favour and indeed in favour of China's own particular form of socialism. Now, you will all be forgiven if you think all this sounds more like medieval theology than modern international relations. I apologise for that. And it's anyone's guess what any of this actually will have to do with concrete foreign policy reality. But we often forget that how a one-party state, in particular a Marxist state, chooses to ideate reality actually matters. It's how the system speaks to itself. It's the political lingua franca among political and policy elites. And the important thing here is that the message from Xi Jinping to his international policy elite gathering in Beijing is one of great confidence. But not just because China wills it to be thus, but because from a Marxist theoretical perspective, which in their view articulates certain immutable laws of political and economic development, the forces of history are now with China. Furthermore, this is a call to greater international policy activism rather than retrenchment given the rise of Trump. In other words, the conclusion is that the great trends of history, or to use an old Soviet term, the overall correlation of forces, are steadily moving China's way. A third change, towards a more sharply focused Chinese diplomacy. This third element of the 2018 Work Conference is its injunction to the country's international policy institutions and personnel to get with the Xi Jinping project. Xi Jinping seems to have the foreign ministry in his sights when he says that, quote, "the reform of the institutions and mechanisms concerning foreign affairs is the internal demand of advancing modernisation in the state governance system and governance capabilities." It'll be recalled from above that party building within the country's foreign policy institutions are to be a core part of the future. On personnel, Xi Jinping reminds the nation's diplomats that they are first and foremost party cadres, ganbu. This has a certain ideological retro to it all. Indeed, it's been a long time since I've heard Chinese diplomats refer to their seniors as cadres, lao ganbu. In fact, I'm not sure that over the last 35 years I can remember that being used. In an earlier period, it was. To quote the Xinhua report, stressing that cadres are the decisive factor affecting the political course, Xi Jinping called for a stronger contingent of foreign affairs personnel that are loyal to the CPC, the country and the people, and are politically solid, professionally competent and strongly disciplined in their conduct. He called on foreign affairs cadres to enhance their ideals and their training so as to upgrade their competency and their overall quality. So does this presage a new type of Chinese foreign ministry diplomat abroad? Perhaps. It's long been reported that Xi Jinping has been frustrated by the performance of parts of his foreign policy establishment. He sees them as proceeding at a glacial pace, whereas China's strategic challenges and opportunities are seen by him as urgent. Once again, this tends to point in the direction of greater foreign policy activism in the future, and a system that is struggling to keep up with the political and policy vision of its leader. Fourth change. China leading the reform of global governance. This is perhaps the sharpest substantive element to emerge from the 2018 Foreign Policy Work Conference in his remarks specifically on the future of global governance. In the 2014 Work Conference, Xi Jinping referred to an impending struggle for the future of the international order. His words. He did not elaborate on what this meant back then, but much work has gone on within the Chinese system since on three interrelated concepts: the international order, 国际制度, the international system, 国际系统, and global governance, 全球管理. Of course, these terms mean different but overlapping things in English as well. Broadly speaking, in Chinese, the term international global order refers to a combination of two things. First, the system comprising the UN, the Bretton Woods institutions, the G20, and other global plurilateral or multilateral institutions. And number two, the US system of global alliances to enforce the US's own definition of international security. Now, the term international system, 国际系统, tends to refer to the first half of what I've just described as the international order, namely the complex web of multilateral institutions which operate under international treaty law and which seek to govern the global commons on the basis of the principle of shared sovereignty. And as for global governance, it tends to refer to the actual performance, for good or for ill, be it effective or ineffective, of the international system so defined. It's significant, however, that at the 2018 Work Conference, Xi Jinping states boldly that a core component of his new ideology of a diplomacy of socialism with Chinese characteristics will be for China to, and I quote him, to lead the reform of the global governance system with the concepts of fairness and justice, unquote. Lead the reform of the global governance system in accordance with the concepts of fairness and justice, unquote. This is new. In my judgment, this is by far the most direct, unqualified and expansive statement on China's intentions on this important question we have seen. China, like the rest of the international community, is acutely conscious of the dysfunctionality of much of the current multilateral system. I've done a report on this over 2 years' time. I'm aware of it, the detail. Our Chinese friends are as well. China also sees, however, the United States walking away from much of the system as well, walking away from the JCPOA, which was agreed on Iran by the UN Security Council, walking away from the UN's Paris Agreement on climate change, the decision to withdraw from the UN Human Rights Commission in Geneva. It's increasingly open defiance of the UN Refugees Convention, and its challenging of the underlying fabric of the WTO. China sees all of this happening in terms of American behaviours. Nature, as we know, abhors a vacuum. International relations even more so. And we all saw Xi Jinping's riposte to President Trump on climate change and trade at Davos 18 months ago, just after the Trump election. If China is indeed serious about leading the reform of global governance, its attitude to various of these multilateral institutions will be radically different to the historical posture of the United States. Take, for example, the Human Rights Council in Geneva, which China would like to see emasculated. Mind you, so too now apparently does the United States administration as well. The reference to China leading the reform of global governance at this work conference is not an accident. It also reflects a growing Chinese diplomatic activism in a number of UN and Bretton Woods institutions around the world, as China begins to seek to recast these institutions, their cultures, their work practices, and their personnel in a direction more compatible with China's core national interests. As I've written before, rather than China having to consistently resist the pressures of westernization inherent in the existing laws, institutions and culture of the current international system, particularly when these prove to be incompatible with the retention of a Marxist-Leninist Chinese state, the resolve of Chinese leadership now seems to be to use its newfound global power to refashion those institutions within the international system that may be most problematic for China on the home front. As for the principles of fairness and justice that Xi Jinping refers to as the core principles that will guide China's reform of global governance, these terms historically implied China's preference for a more multipolar international system in which the unilateral voice of the United States is reduced. China has already developed a strong constituency in Africa, parts of Asia and Latin America in support of this. Multipolarity in Chinese strategic parlance is code for the dilution of American power in the post-war international system. And finally, China's core national interests. Lest anyone get too starry-eyed about China's intentions for reforming global governance, in Xi Jinping's description of the core principles of its new diplomacy of socialism with Chinese characteristics, Xi Jinping concludes his list of 10 governing principles with the following: that China, I quote him, must take its core national interests as the bottom line to safeguard China's sovereignty, security and development interests, unquote. Xi makes plain that China's foreign policy is unapologetically nationalist. Xi assumes that all other countries' foreign policies are nationalist as well. Of course, China's definition of its core national interests has evolved over time, as have other nations. It now includes, for example, the South China Sea. A decade ago, this was not a feature of Chinese official statements defining China's core national interests. Now it is. As for any state, therefore, the concept of core national interests varies over time and will be defined by the government of the day. To conclude, we will soon see how the 2018 Central Foreign Policy Work Conference translates into different Chinese foreign policy behaviours on the ground. If the 2014 conference is an effective guide, we will see a heightened period of Chinese foreign policy activism. However, the price content of that activism remains to be seen. But what we are seeing is the slow, steady emergence of a more integrated Chinese worldview, which links China's domestic vision with its international vision, and a vision which very much reflects the deep views of China's paramount leader, Xi Jinping. The first policy terrain where we are likely to see this is in the existing institutions of global governance. But it will not be restricted to this area. The text of the report of the 2018 Foreign Policy Work Conference suggests that we will also see this across China's bilateral relations, its engagement with regional institutions, as well as its approach to major power relations as well, all of which are likely to be met with an increasingly forthright Chinese diplomacy. The challenge for the rest of the international community is to define what type of future international order, system and governance it wants, and to take China's invitation seriously to engage the Middle Kingdom in a frank and forthright discourse on what the region and the world precisely want if any future global community of common destiny is in fact to come to pass. For example, what does the EU want for the future international system, the future international order and future global governance? What does ASEAN want? What does the East Asian Summit want? What does the African Union want? What does the Organization of American States want? What does the Gulf Cooperation Council want? And what exactly does America want, with or without Trump? And in this dialogue, how will the values already entrenched in the UN Charter, Bretton Woods and the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, as well as the founding instruments of these various regional organisations, be preserved for the future? The future of the global order is now in a state of some flux, in part induced by the recent posture of the United States, in part induced by the rise of China. China, it seems, has a clear script for the future. It's time for the rest of the international community to do the same. I thank you.
All the changes that you have identified tells us that China will be more assertive, has a theory behind its foreign policy. But what's the end game? I asked the question about the end game because based where you are in New York, I think many Americans are concerned, as you probably will remember, some years ago, Graham Allison of the Thucydides Trap and Robert Blackwell, both at the Kennedy School, asked the late Lee Kuan Yew this is one of the last interviews that Lee Kuan Yew gave. Does China want to replace the US as the #1 power in Asia and beyond? And Mr. Lee's answer was, yes, of course it wants to. After all, they've lifted 700 million people from poverty, right? And they believe they have the right to do so. But for this century, by which he means the 21st century, what China wants is equality. They can leave the rest till later. I was wondering, Mr. Rudd, what do you think of that?
Well, I was fortunate enough also to spend some time in discussions with Lee Kuan Yew. When I was Prime Minister of Australia, I would call in here from time to time, and it's always good to sit at the feet of the master and to learn a few things. I was a young kid on the block. I'd recently been elected as Prime Minister of Australia, and Lee Kuan Yew was very much the old head on the block who knew a thing or two. And I benefited from those discussions enormously. And my questions to him were very much like Graham's and Bob Blackwell's, which is, what's the Chinese endgame in your assessment? And his reflections in response to that are consistent with what you've just read out from Graham and Bob's book, which is, I think, entitled Lessons from the Master.
Yes.
I spent a year at the Kennedy School with those guys, and my first year of political exile from Australia after I came second in our national elections. That means I lost, by the way. So let me answer the question in 2 or 3 quick parts. So what's the end game? One is national, which is the end game for Xi Jinping is for the Chinese Communist Party to remain in power. Western audiences need to understand that. This misty-eyed view that I have repeatedly put to me in the United States over recent times of gradual evolution, I think is just misty-eyed. 2, the end game is exactly what he says. It's a 小康社会. It's a relatively well-off society, and one which by the mid-century point is a fully developed economy with living standards like you see in OECD countries. 3, he wants a clean environment. The whole push towards environmental sustainability, or what the Chinese refer to as eco-civilizations, 生态文明. That's part of it. It's a recent part of it, but it's an important part of it. Chinese people want to breathe in their cities and to raise their kids healthy, like all of us do. The 4th is it wants to have the motherland united, and that means Taiwan, by one means or another. 5, China wants a benign environment with its 14 neighbouring land borders. China has more land neighbours and land borders than any other country in the world except Russia, which also has 14. And the history of China, which is for so many centuries of its history of its civilization, is that problems come from either the Xiongnu in the north, the Manchurians in the northeast, the Mongols, whoever else. All the mafan comes from over your borders. And then Lao Ri, 他们都来了. And so then you have the Japanese come. That's 更麻烦. And so that is a deep end state. And then beyond that, in Greater East Asia, which comes to your point with, and my conversation also with Harry Lee, is that China does not want East Asia and the Western Pacific to remain as a zone of US strategic influence. It wants US alliances in the region ended, and for China to have, shall I say, a comfortable, accommodating, wider foreign and security policy environment across wider East Asia. And then to round out the picture, on its continental periphery, which is what extends from China's western borders all the way to Rotterdam, hence Belt and Road, and a few other places in between, China also wants, for the first time, a benign western frontier across the Eurasian landmass, where China has deep anxieties about the future impact
of radical Islam in the West, and in Xinjiang in particular. And more broadly, to finish on this, the global order, the global rules-based system. China would like a global rules-based order which is not something which they are required to consume, having been written by a bunch of Westerners who were former colonial powers meeting in San Francisco in 1945, but for the rules of the system to be more reflective of Chinese interests and a Chinese voice. That, I believe, is kind of the integrated end state so far as I can give it shape and form. Whether China can get there or not, there are going to be a lot of counter voices on the way through, from the region, from the United States, a whole bunch of other people as well.
Thank you. Thank you very much. We would like now to open the discussion to the floor. And please use one of the mics. So gentlemen over there and over here. And if you could identify yourself and keep your questions short. That way we'll be able to take in more questions.
Hi, good evening, Kevin. Welcome back to Singapore. My name is Ace. Hi there. I have two burning questions for you. My first question is...
Ace of spades or ace of clubs?
Ace of anything you like.
Okay.
My first question is that, will there be a World War III if US and China were to be at war? My second question, how can the world and North Korea leader, Kim Jong-un, be assured that his regime will be safe and secured when he has fulfilled the CVID or the disarmament, and not be a victim like Muammar Gaddafi? I read that ICANN's website has stated that the US has about 7,000 nuclear weapons as compared to North Korea has only less than 50. Is it still possible and practical that the world be free from nuclear weapons? Thank you. 谢谢您，陆克文导师。
On the question of conflict and war between the United States, I'm a great friend and fan and supporter of Graham Allison's, because we're colleagues, we work together, and I get referred to in a lot of the endnotes in his book on Thucydides' Trap. Of course, the editors of the book wanted to sell copies of the book, so they gave it the title Destined for War, US and China. That's what editors do. They're like newspaper editors. They want to soup it up and make it sound as sharp as possible to sell as many. Graham's book doesn't quite say that. He arrays for his 16 historical case studies, huge methodological debate within the academy in terms of the representative nature of those case studies from 1500 to the present, and should there be more, should there be less, etc. But overall, his book is simply a warning that there is something alive in the notion of established powers and rising powers that, if we're not very careful, can result in conflict and war. If I get my act together in the next 6 months, I intend to write a short monograph book in response to it, which is going to be called The US and China, the Avoidable War, and how we can manage that. And so I've got a few thoughts around those lines, because I think the debate in Washington at this time is getting a little bit out of control in terms of defining China as the comprehensive enemy of the future. And also there is some sentiment in parts of Beijing as well, parts of Beijing. So my own view is this is entirely avoidable. And your parallel question is, does it lead to World War III? Well, it would. We could just forget the Asian century, put it that way. That's the end of that. You know the consequences which flow. Your final question, which is about the DPRK or North Korea, in terms of the nature of the agreement which could be struck. Look, what I noticed most carefully about the four-part statement coming out of Singapore, and congratulations to our friends in Singapore for hosting such a successful summit. I mean, you managed to contain two giant egos within one island. Donald Trump and Kim Jong-un. I mean, congratulations, Singapore. I mean, that takes talent. I'm not sure anyone else's geography could have accommodated that. Anyway, back to the serious part of your question. I think CVRD, comprehensive, verifiable, and irreversible disarmament, was not reflected in the document at all. And despite the best attempts of the US side to get there, it just wasn't within the negotiating scope of the DPRK side. Personally, I doubt it ever will be. I believe and I base this on intuition rather than hard evidence, that where the two sides may wish to push this negotiation is to perhaps find an agreement which can be reached on the question of intercontinental range missiles, that is, those which directly threat continental United States, while effectively leaving intact these short and medium range missiles and a given quantity of nuclear material within the DPRK for regime preservation purposes. That may then render redundant the question of international security guarantees. I'll leave it there.
We know your Chinese is very good, and you understand China quite well.
Mama Hu.
Okay. There has been an interesting phenomenon that in China, Chinese people always say we are misunderstood by the West. But in the West, people said, why China behaves like this? So even you understand China quite well, do you still can't understand some behaviors China is doing?
That's a very sensitive question. How can I avoid answering that? I think in the business of the future of U.S.-China relations, and let's come back to that, because that's the binary relationship here, and it's not the total relationship for all of us. You're Singaporeans, I'm Australian, even though I live in the United States. But frankly, the two giant elephants in the front living room can wreck most of the furniture, okay? And so let's focus on those two. I find the level of wujie and misunderstanding in both capitals still quite significant. The wujie in Washington is sometimes frightening. But also, I think what I find often in Beijing is an assumption that what is simply a mistake or a miscommunication in American policy is some deeply laid out strategic plan on the part of the United States, when it's just, frankly, a stuff-up. If you know anything about the functioning of Western parliamentary democracies, there are lots of stuff-ups. So I think the question of miscomprehension, misunderstanding is large. Then you run into an area where I think you have objective differences and perhaps irreconcilable differences in terms of deep strategic interests. And these cannot be wished away through another seminar or another seminar. And for example, the core of that would be the future of Taiwan. And we need to be very blunt about that and decide how it's to be handled. So I wrote a report on U.S.-China relations about 3 years ago, just after my year at Harvard, with Graham Allison and Joe Nye and the rest of the team, Bob Blackwell and the rest, on the future of U.S.-China relations under Xi Jinping, where I wrote about the concept of what I described as constructive realism, 建设性的现实主义. And the reason I did that was because to be constructively realistic means to put things into 4 boxes. What do we actually agree upon? What do we radically disagree on? What is difficult but we might get there in the end? And what do we actually, frankly, don't understand about each other? At present, the discourse between the two countries washes between these 3 boxes the whole time. And when I always hear, 两方面都缺少那个互信, both sides lack mutual trust, well, of course. Is the Pope a Catholic? It's kind of inevitable. That's an Australian expression. It means, yes, of course. And the Pope is a Catholic. But you need, therefore, to build trust on working together collaboratively on stuff that you can agree on. Even on the hard stuff, like North Korea, that would build enormous strategic trust between the US and China if you could land an outcome. But unless you approach it, I think, with that level of methodology, I worry that we're simply going to wash between these areas all the time and begin to see the relationship degrade and degenerate over time. That is my deepest fear now.
I get 2 questions. The first is that in this foreign policy meeting that you mentioned, Wang Qishan's name was prominently mentioned as a member, which is very unusual. And consider that Wang Qishan is a super pragmatic guy who will say that 党纪大于国法 in stamping out the corruptions. So how's your personal feeling of what role he can play in the foreign policy of the president? And the second question you mentioned is that the Taiwan issue is one of the endgame scenario, probably the most critical. And China has put a 2035 powerful country and 2049, 2050 on the leading edge of global power countries. And in history, there's no powerful countries that is split countries. So how do you put a time frame on the conjecture on the issue of Taiwan between the United States and China?
When you were speaking about the end game, I don't think you mentioned ideology at all. So you mentioned geopolitics, economics, wealth.
I started with the party. It's sort of a subsection of that.
Sorry, yes. But could you elaborate more on the logical extreme of socialism with Chinese characteristics? Does Xi Jinping believe in the Marxist progression into communism, and how does that look like in the future? Would the ideology evolve even more?
Wang Qishan, the fireman, fireman Wang. So where's the big fire on at the moment? U.S. China, 大火, and so my instincts tell me that's where Xi Dada is going to try and use him. I think a visit is being planned for Wang Qishan to the United States soon. 据我的了解 and 有关的部门这样说了. So you see there's an asymmetry at the moment. You have Liu He in the Zhengzhiju, who is responsible for the U.S.-China economic relationship and all of its complexity. But on the depths of the security policy relationship, and let's call it the ultimate political relationship, there is not a point person. At this stage, it does not seem to be Yang Jiechi, even though he's in charge of the Foreign Affairs Office of the Central Committee. My instinct is that, therefore, Fireman Wang is about to be sent to Washington and more broadly to deal with trying to land a sustainable framework for the U.S.-China relationship. And if that happens, I think that's a good thing. I mean, I know him reasonably well, met him quite a number of times, and I think he certainly has a deep reading of the United States and the West, as well as, of course, confidence of his own political leader. As for Taiwan, my attitude to that is I take your point about historical timeframes and disunited great powers. But at the point at which anyone starts to mutter a time frame, we're in serious trouble. It automatically organises politics on both sides of the Taiwan Straits, and we end up in a truly horrible trajectory. So I'm all for the 保护现状 kind of. Sometimes in diplomacy and politics, the wisest thing you can do is kick the can down the road. Remember Deng, next generation, much smarter than us, much smarter than us. Haven't met them yet, but they're bound to be much smarter than us. So, 送给你小礼物 Taiwan. And now on the question, your very good question, sir, where are you? Over here? Here, on ideology. It's a really sharp question. For my sins, I should confess this to this semi-academic gathering. I am now enrolled as a DPhil student at the Oxford China Centre in London. Oh, sorry, in Oxford, not in London. And I'm working on Xi Jinping's worldview. So for the first time in my life, I've had to read Marxism. Okay, it's not a popular subject in Australia. We don't sort of talk a lot about Marxism down there. And but to understand two things. One is, let's call it a Marxist analytical framework, which you'll be familiar with, and the disciplines being dialectical materialism and historical materialism, and to understand the interrelationship between, thesis, antithesis, and synthesis, as, let's call it, a discipline for understanding reality. And I know enough about what I've read from Xi Jinping so far that his training is deeply Marxist in his analytical framework of understanding what happens within the country and what is now happening in the dialectical relationship between states. Now, the other half of your question is a much more problematic one, which is, what is the end game? And the end game of, let's call it, the first part of my response to it, which is a permanence of the party, but is that purely a Leninist party of opportunity, which is we simply control it because we're the new emperors and China's always worked with central control. So 列宁呢就是新的皇帝. Well, no. There is content, but I would be not being honest with you if I said I've reached any conclusion on where they have reached internally on this question. And I believe it's still in flux. If you want a simple illustration, on my mobile phone recently, I was somewhere in China, probably in Shanghai, I think. I was stopped at a traffic light. And there next to me was 社会主义的道德. Okay, big from the 宣传部, huge propaganda thing there. And I said, I've always wanted to know what the core morals or the 价值观 is, the values of socialism. There are 12 of them, and I can't list them all to you. But the 12 of them are largely, in part, they are internally contradictory. And secondly, they certainly do not form part of an integrated, shall I say, systemology in terms of where a Marxist worldview would take you. It strikes me very much as a bringing together of elements of the tradition and elements of Marxism and elements of something else. So for me, that is a manifestation of the fact that the ideological work in terms of the ideological content of the endgame is still very much in process. And institutes in Beijing, both at the Dangxiao and the 社会主义学院, are working on this. So I think it's a work in progress. So if they're still working on it, I can't pronounce on where they're going to conclude.
Thank you very much for elevating the conversation beyond the headlines, as you said. At the risk of dragging it back to the trade and economic front, a big focus obviously has been this issue of the tariffs between the U.S. and China. But this particular week, it's going to be all about investment and the investment restrictions that the Trump administration is thinking of placing on inbound flows from China. Obviously, this isn't an issue unique to the U.S. and Australia and your home country. It's a very much a live issue in the EU and in the UK and even to some extent in India. So the broader question then is, what is the right balance between embracing inbound flows from China, which is important for investment for companies and jobs, but also protecting some of the national security considerations? Because we will be living with this debate for some decades to come. And given your experience with one foot in Australia, the US, and China, I'd appreciate your thoughts on that balance.
I'd like to pose a question about, you stated in your speech how one of the changes to the foreign policy would be to sort of, with a departure of the US from global order, how China would be taking a sort of more driving seat, deciding the course of this global order. What could you project if the US suddenly returned to taking the driving seat? Would China and the US be able to share sort of this deciding the course of the world in the global order, or would they be trying to decide which one was better than the other?
I wonder what's Australia's choice under the current Turnbull administration, because we now have noticed that tension between Australia and the US on things such as immigration issues, and also the tension between Australia and China regarding the foreign interference. So would you say that what the Turnbull administration's motive is contradicting to what Prof. Hugh White has argued? Like there's a power transition between the US and China, and so that the Asian countries should embrace this future and admit that there will be a coexistence between the US and China in Asia.
I'm going to ask you a very simple question.
I knew this would be hard.
Yeah. And it's going to be about Donald Trump, okay? Because we haven't really spoken too much about Donald. So I'd like your opinions on Donald Trump's national strategy and his global strategy.
Donald Trump, I've met him once, so I can't elaborate in terms of direct personal knowledge. Look, I think when you look at President Trump, what you see is what you get. I mean, this guy is the product of forces at work within the United States body politic. He didn't cause anti-globalization. He's the manifestation of anti-globalization. And that's how, albeit narrowly, he managed to win that election. So the reason I say that is that when we listen to Donald Trump, my own judgment, both as someone who's trained as a diplomat, but someone who's practiced as a politician in a highly competitive democracy, is that when Trump speaks on global questions, Trump is speaking primarily to his domestic voter base because he wants to, A, not surrender the House or the Senate to the Democrats in the midterms due in November, and B, he definitely doesn't want to lose the next election. And so I know there are no country on the planet where foreign policy is clinically separated from domestic politics. If we were sitting around the Politburo table at Zhongnanhai at the moment, domestic considerations shape what China does in the world. It happens with all of us. But when we look at the public language of President Trump, we need to be very mindful of the fact that I think that's driven in large part by his domestic political calculus. What worries me about that is that therefore, internationally, domestically there's an end game, I win. Internationally, there is no conceived end game, which is arguably nobody wins. On the question of the first question I was asked about tariffs and investment restrictions, and Australia being the example. I think you're up there somewhere, sir. Look, there's no magic to this. When we're in office, we, Australia, at that stage, were receiving by far and above the single largest number of foreign direct investment applications from China compared with any country in the world. Partly because of the resources sector, but more generally because of the general economy and the opportunities, and because we are a very open economy. We have been for a long time. And that's part of the reason why I would argue Australia is a relatively successful economy. It's been, on a bipartisan basis, very open for at least the last quarter of a century, third of a century, product of both sides of politics. However, when you reach difficult decisions, which in the case of we do with foreign investment applications from various countries, then the only criteria that you have is called the national interest criteria. In Australia in 1976, we established something called the Foreign Investment Review Board. China was still in the Cultural Revolution when we established the Foreign Investment Review Board. We did not establish it to keep Chinese investment out. We had it established so that we could properly assess investment applications from the Americans, from the British, from the Japanese, then from the Koreans, wanting to buy X, Y, and Z, A, B, and C. And we needed criteria through which the government of the day could be advised as to the net economic advantage to the country or not, or if there was any national security implications, to be so advised as well. Of all the applications we received from China, from memory, we probably approved about 92, 93% of them. And those we declined, I think we rejected one or two outright, and we sent the others back for further work. Further work was too hard, and so they didn't come back. So, so overall, that's how we handled it. I think what I'm surprised about is the lack of maturity relative to our own national experience in Australia of what's now unfolding in Europe and to some extent the United States, where they have not had as well-established regime for handling foreign investment applications as we've been forced to have for the last 30 or 40 years. Europe, it's a relatively new phenomenon. You go to Germany these days, people are running around saying, we've got to control Chinese investment, as if it's the first time they've had to face a decision about a foreign investor from anywhere. This surprises me, but that's the reality. So the final thing I'd say on foreign investment is this. When I did reject, as Prime Minister, certain particular applications from China, I did say in response, when I got attacked vigorously in Quanzhou Ribao and Global Times and those sort of newspapers in China for being fanhua, which I thought was kind of interesting. I said, okay, guys, I'll have a debate with you. You say that I should give you access to every element of the Australian mining industry. I'd really like to go and begin a big mining development in the middle of Lop Nor in Qinghai, okay? Has to be close to your nuclear testing site, but just forget about that. I mean, the bottom line is everyone has their national security considerations. Everyone has certain defined strategic industries. And reciprocity is a key factor as well in terms of having a parallel investment environment in the originating country, which would enable investments from my country to go there as well. That, I think, is the second parallel principle. Very briefly on the two last questions which were asked, one was on your point, young man, about the departure of the United States. What if it comes back again? There's a fascinating debate in the United States which is around three things. G2, China, the United States. G1, China or the United States. G0, known in the literature as the Kindleberger trap, which is nobody's running anything. Okay, all three are difficult. I think the reality is, here is my suggestion, is that given the polarization of things currently between China and the United States, it's time for the G20 to now come into a new zone of its own in global governance, beyond simply global economic governance, but also on questions which are now deeply problematic on global political and security governance as well. The reason I say that is it's not just China and the United States. It is the major emerging countries, economies, and political systems in the world. There is India, there is China, there is Indonesia, there is Brazil, there is Mexico, as well as Turkey, as well as Western countries. And having been in a number of these summits myself and having been one of its co-creators, it's manageable around a table of 20 to work through some of these things, just as it's unmanageable to resolve these things through the UN General Assembly, just as it is utterly unrepresentative to do these things in a meeting of two between China and the United States. Like Spain and Portugal back in the 16th century when the Pope tried to divide the world between two Catholic powers, it didn't end terribly well. But your question is a good one. So what I'm saying is none of the above. Look at an institution which is sufficiently representative of the world today to make efficient decisions, but not so representative that it cannot make any decisions, which is currently the nature, frankly, of the United Nations system. And finally, my friend about a choice under Turnbull and my views about Hugh White. I think, look, I have a pretty old-fashioned view about this stuff in Australia, at least. That's the question is directed there. It's called the Advanced International Relations Theory of Kevin Rudd. It's called walking and chewing gum at the same time, which is we can be ally of the United States and be a very strong partner of China's in political and economic terms without these becoming mutually exclusive propositions. And as soon as we believe in our heads that these are mutually exclusive propositions, there's a problem. That's why I keep saying to the Australian body politic who run around sometimes like chooks with their heads cut off, that's like chickens, with their heads cut off on this question, everyone should just take a deep breath and realise that we are going through deep changes in the global and regional order. There is nothing inherently fatally contradictory about these two propositions. We can be fully engaged with both, just as they are fully at present engaged with each other.
Thank you very much, Mr. Rudd.